the rural landscape of Edgefield County, South Carolina, in the mid-19th century appeared tranquil to the casual observer. Broad fields rolled gently beneath wide-open skies, interrupted only by stately plantation homes that stood as visible markers of wealth, order, and social hierarchy. These estates projected an image of stability and refinement, suggesting a way of life rooted in tradition and prosperity. Visitors passing through the region might have admired the symmetry of the land, the disciplined routines of plantation life, and the apparent harmony between labor and ownership. Yet this outward calm masked a deeply fractured moral reality, one sustained by silence, fear, and inherited power. Beneath the surface of agricultural productivity and social ceremony existed a system dependent upon exploitation so complete that it reshaped every human relationship it touched. The tragedy that unfolded on the Lambert Plantation in 1846 did not emerge suddenly or without warning. Rather, it was the inevitable result of decades of unchecked abuse, carefully guarded secrets, and moral denial passed down from one generation to the next. The plantation system itself provided the foundation for such tragedy. Enslavement was not merely an economic arrangement, but a social structure that granted absolute authority to landowners while denying humanity to those they controlled. Within this system, violence was normalized, coercion was routine, and accountability was nearly non-existent. The law, the church, and community norms worked together to protect wealthy planters, reinforcing the belief that their actions, however cruel, were justified by ownership. Over time, this environment fostered a dangerous sense of entitlement, allowing abuses to flourish without consequence. In such a setting, morality became flexible, shaped not by justice or compassion, but by power and convenience. The Lambert Plantation was established in 1798 by Donovan Lambert, an English immigrant whose ambition far exceeded any sense of ethical responsibility. Arriving in South Carolina during a period of rapid agricultural expansion, Donovan quickly recognized that land ownership combined with slave labor offered a direct path to wealth and influence. With little concern for the human cost, he began acquiring land and enslaved workers, expanding his holdings through calculated cruelty and relentless ambition. What began as a modus operandi soon developed into one of the region's most productive estates, admired by neighboring planters for its efficiency and profitability. Donovan's success earned him respect within local elite circles, further insulating him from scrutiny or moral challenge. Enslaved labor sustained every aspect of the plantation's success. From sunrise to sunset, men, women, and children worked the fields, harvested crops, maintained infrastructure, and supported the refined domestic life enjoyed within the main house. Their labor generated the wealth that allowed the Lambert family to live comfortably, host social gatherings, and cultivate an image of gentility. Yet this comfort was built upon relentless suffering. Donovan ruled his property with absolute authority, enforcing discipline through physical punishment, psychological intimidation, and constant surveillance. Resistance, whether real or perceived, was met with swift and brutal consequences. Fear became a central tool of control, ensuring obedience while eroding any sense of personal dignity among the enslaved population. Donovan's reputation for brutality was well known within the surrounding community. Stories of harsh punishment and relentless demands circulated quietly, yet few dared to challenge him openly. The legal and social systems of the time existed largely to protect men of his status, reinforcing the notion that plantation owners were beyond reproach, as long as the plantation remained profitable and outwardly orderly. The suffering within its boundaries was dismissed as an unfortunate but acceptable aspect of Southern life. This collective indifference allowed Donovan's cruelty to continue, unchecked, embedding violence deeply into the culture of the plantation. Beyond his visible cruelty lay a more insidious form of abuse that remained largely unspoken but widely suspected. Donovan regularly forced himself upon enslaved women, exercising sexual power with the same entitlement he applied to labor and discipline. These acts were both illegal and immoral, yet they were rendered invisible by a society that refused to recognize enslaved individuals as victims capable of suffering harm. Enslaved women were denied bodily autonomy, their vulnerability intensified by their complete lack of legal protection. Donovan's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation that blurred the boundaries between ownership and violation. The children born of these assaults were treated as inconveniences rather than human beings. Their existence threatened Donovan's public reputation and disrupted the carefully maintained image of moral respectability. As a result, these children were often sold away, separated from their mothers, or concealed within the system through deliberate manipulation of records and transactions. Families were torn apart with calculated efficiency, ensuring that evidence of wrongdoing disappeared before it could attract attention. The emotional and psychological trauma inflicted by these separations extended far beyond individual victims, shaping the collective experience of the enslaved community and reinforcing a culture of grief and fear. Over time, the consequences of Donovan's actions embedded themselves into the very fabric of the plantation. Silence became a survival strategy, and truth was treated as a threat. Enslaved individuals learned that speaking out invited punishment rather than justice, while members of the Lambert family learned that maintaining power required denial and concealment. These patterns did not end with Donovan's life. They were passed down, unexamined, to the next generation. By the time the moral decay that defined Donovan Lambert's rule set the stage for everything that followed. His legacy was not limited to land, wealth, or social standing. It included unresolved violence, buried truths, and a distorted understanding of power. The tragedy of 1846 would ultimately reveal that such legacies cannot remain hidden forever. When abuse is protected by silence and authority, it does not disappear, it multiplies, waiting for the moment when its accumulated weight becomes impossible to contain. Donovan's death in 1845 marked the end of an era on the Lambert Plantation, though it did not bring an end to the consequences of his rule. His absence removed a visible source of cruelty, yet the systems he had built remained firmly in place, shaping daily life and moral understanding long after his passing. The plantation itself stood unchanged, its fields still cultivated by enslaved labor and its wealth still derived from exploitation. What passed from Donovan to his only legitimate son, Craig Lambert, was not merely land or property but a legacy defined by power, silence, and unresolved violence. Craig inherited a system designed to function without accountability, one that rewarded authority while discouraging reflection. Though he believed himself capable of reshaping that legacy, he underestimated the depth of its influence. Craig Lambert had been educated in the North, an experience that distinguished him from many Southern planters of his generation. Exposure to different political conversations and social attitudes led him to believe that he possessed a more enlightened perspective on the world. He prided himself on being thoughtful, measured, and morally restrained, especially in comparison to his father. In his own mind, Craig represented progressive man capable of tempering tradition with reason, Upon returning to South Carolina, he made several small changes intended to reflect this self-image. Housing for enslaved workers was modestly improved. Rations were slightly increased, and the most overt forms of corporal punishment were reduced. These measures earned him a reputation as a kinder master, both among neighboring planters and within his own household. Yet these reforms were superficial, shaped more by efficiency than by genuine compassion. Craig believed that healthier, less fearful workers would be more productive and easier to manage. At no point did he question the moral foundation of slavery itself. Enslaved individuals remained property under his ownership, their lives governed by his authority and subject to his needs. The reforms did not challenge the system. They merely softened its most visible edges by focusing on intent rather than impact. Craig convinced himself that he had broken from his father's legacy, when in reality he continued to benefit from and perpetuate the same structure of domination. This belief in his own moral superiority proved dangerously misleading. Craig became convinced that good intentions could absolve him of responsibility, that personal kindness could offset systemic injustice. He failed to recognize that within a system of enslavement, every interaction was shaped by coercion, regardless of tone or demeanor. The imbalance of power between master and enslaved person was absolute, rendering true consent impossible. Craig's refusal to acknowledge this truth left him vulnerable to repeating the very patterns he believed he had escaped. His blindness would become tragically evident in his interactions with Lena, a young enslaved woman who worked within the Lambert household. Lena had been brought to the plantation as a child, her early years shaped by separation and survival. Raised under close supervision within the main house, she was trained in domestic service from a young age and expected to demonstrate obedience, discretion, and emotional restraint at all times. Life within the household demanded constant vigilance. Servants were expected to anticipate needs, remain invisible when necessary, and suppress personal feelings. Despite these constraints, Lena developed a quiet resilience. She was intelligent and observant, learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the household with care. Her composure was not the result of comfort, but of adaptation, a skill developed to survive in an environment where missteps carried severe consequences. Lena's proximity to power placed her in a uniquely vulnerable position. Working within the main house meant constant exposure to the Lambert family, including Craig himself. Unlike field laborers, domestic servants were subject not only to physical control but also to emotional scrutiny. Craig began to notice Lena not merely as a servant but as an individual. He was drawn to her intelligence, her calm demeanor, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. In his isolation and uncertainty as a new master, Craig found comfort in conversation with someone who seemed to listen without judgment. What began as brief, casual exchanges gradually deepened into longer conversations. Craig spoke openly about his frustrations, his doubts, and his desire to be different from his father. Lena listened, aware that attentiveness was both expected and rewarded. Over time, Craig began to interpret her presence as a form of mutual understanding. He mistook her restraint for trust, her politeness for affection. Fueled by loneliness and a desire for connection, he allowed himself to believe that their interactions existed outside the boundaries of power that defined their relationship. For Lena, these interactions carried an entirely different meaning. While she may have felt a sense of familiarity or even affection, she understood that her safety depended on compliance. Refusing attention from the master of the plantation was not a viable option. Every conversation existed within an unspoken context of authority, one that limited her ability to set boundaries or express discomfort. The attention Craig offered was both protective and dangerous, promising stability while threatening exposure to harm. Lena existed at the intersection of visibility and vulnerability, where being noticed could lead to favor or punishment. As Craig's feelings deepened, the imbalance of power grew more pronounced. He interpreted the relationship as consensual, even romantic, because he failed to recognize the coercive environment in which it existed. His position allowed him the illusion of choice, while Lena's did not. To Craig, the relationship represented personal growth and emotional connection. To Lena, it represented a narrowing path, one where survival required careful navigation of another person's desires. This fundamental disconnect between perception and reality would shape everything that followed. Craig's inability to see beyond his own intentions blinded him to the harm embedded within his actions. Lena's silence, born of necessity rather than consent, became the foundation upon which tragedy would be built. What neither fully understood at the time was that their relationship was not an exception to the system of slavery, but a product of it, carrying within it the same destructive forces that had shaped the plantation for generations. Estella Lambert, Craig's mother, observed the changes within the household with growing unease. Years of living alongside Donovan Lambert had taught her to recognize the subtle warning signs of power exercised without restraint. Though Donovan was no longer alive, the atmosphere he had cultivated lingered, shaping behavior and expectations long after his death. Estella had spent decades balancing her public role as a respectable plantation wife with her private awareness of moral compromise. She had benefited from wealth, social standing, and comfort. Yet these privileges came at the cost of emotional isolation and ethical surrender. Survival within her marriage required silence, patience, and an ability to look away from truths that could not be safely confronted. Because of this history, Estella possessed a heightened sensitivity to patterns of behavior that others might dismiss. She noticed the increasing familiarity between Craig and Lena almost immediately, the prolonged conversations, the subtle shifts in tone, the way Lena was summoned more frequently under vague pretexts. These signs stirred memories Estella would have preferred to forget. She recognized echoes of Donovan's conduct in her son's actions, a realization that filled her with dread. Yet reconciling this recognition with her belief in Craig's character proved profoundly difficult. She wanted to believe that her son, shaped by education and distance from his father's influence, was incapable of repeating such harm. This tension between what she observed and what she wished to believe created a deep internal conflict. Estella's attempts to intervene reflected a lifetime of learned caution. Direct confrontation had rarely produced safety in her marriage to Donovan. Instead, it often led to emotional punishment or withdrawal. As a result, she relied on indirect methods, subtle warnings, carefully phrased suggestions, and appeals to propriety rather than morality. She reminded Craig of appearances, of the risks of scandal, and of the responsibilities that accompanied his position. She framed her concerns in terms of social consequences rather than ethical ones, hoping that caution might succeed where moral argument would fail. However, these efforts were limited by her own fear and by Craig's confidence in his intentions. As Craig grew more emotionally invested in Lena, Estella's influence diminished. The household itself seemed to shift, growing tense with unspoken awareness. Servants noticed changes in routine and demeanor, yet no one dared speak openly. Silence, long practiced as a means of survival, tightened its grip. Within this environment, the imbalance of power between Craig and Lena became increasingly apparent, though it remained largely unacknowledged by those who benefited from it. Lena existed within a narrow margin of safety, one defined by obedience. and restraint. Refusing Craig's advances was not a realistic option. Any sign of resistance could result in punishment, reassignment, or forced sale. Outcomes that threatened both physical safety and emotional stability. Her survival depended on compliance, yet compliance came at the cost of autonomy. Lena was forced to navigate a relationship shaped by authority rather than choice, where affection and fear were inextricably linked. Despite these constraints, Lena experienced genuine emotional conflict. Craig's attention offered moments of warmth and validation in a life otherwise governed by control. His words suggested the possibility of recognition beyond servitude, and his promises, however unrealistic, sparked fragile hope. Lena had grown up within the system of slavery and understood its brutality, yet hope remained a powerful force. The idea that Craig might eventually free her, acknowledge their relationship, or provide security for their future, allowed her to imagine a life beyond perpetual subjugation. This hope did not erase her fear, but it complicated it, making resistance emotionally as well as practically difficult. When Lena discovered she was pregnant, these conflicting emotions intensified. The pregnancy represented both possibility and danger. On one hand, it seemed to validate Craig's promises, offering tangible evidence of connection and the potential for change. On the other, it exposed Lena to profound risk. Pregnancy made secrecy impossible and placed her body under even greater scrutiny. She understood that enslaved women who became pregnant by their owners were often blamed, punished, or discarded when they became inconvenient. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, yet hope persisted, fragile but insistent. Craig's response to the pregnancy further revealed his inability to grasp the reality of the situation. He spoke openly of manumission and legitimacy, imagining a future in which Lena and their child could exist openly within society. These ideas reflected his belief that personal intention could overcome structural barriers. He failed to recognize the rigid racial and legal frameworks that defined Southern life. Laws explicitly prohibited interracial marriage, limited manumission, and denied legal recognition to children born of such unions. Craig's vision of the future was shaped more by desire than by reality, allowing him to ignore the dangers Lena faced. For Lena, Craig's optimism was both comforting and unsettling. His confidence suggested protection, yet it was grounded in a misunderstanding of the world they inhabited. Lena understood that promises offered no guarantee of safety. The system that controlled her life was not easily dismantled by goodwill, and its consequences were often swift and unforgiving. Still, the possibility of freedom, however distant, exerted a powerful pull. It encouraged her to endure uncertainty, to trust in a future that may never arrive. Estella watched these developments with increasing alarm. She recognized that the pregnancy marked a point of no return, one that transformed private transgression into undeniable reality. The careful balance she had maintained within the household began to unravel. She feared not only for Lena's safety, but also for her son's moral and emotional well-being. Yet her capacity to act remained constrained by the same forces that had shaped her life: patriarchal authority, social expectation, and fear of exposure. The convergence of hope and fear, intention and denial, set the stage for inevitable tragedy. Craig's refusal to acknowledge the full weight of his power, Lena's inability to escape it, and Estella's constrained attempts at intervention created a volatile dynamic. Each individual acted within limits, shaped by history and structure, yet those limits did not absolve them of consequence. The pregnancy, rather than offering a path toward resolution, deepened the contradictions at the heart of the plantation system. ensuring that the truths long suppressed would soon demand recognition. The pregnancy forced secrecy upon all involved. Only Estella and Mammy Elisa, the plantation's elderly midwife, were informed. Mammy Elisa occupied a position of complex authority, having assisted in countless births and witnessed generations of Lambert family secrets. Her knowledge extended far beyond medicine, encompassing histories of violence and concealment that others preferred to forget. When she learned of Lena's condition, dread overtook her. She recognized patterns that others could not see, patterns rooted in truths long buried. Mammy Eliza knew that Lena was Donovan Lambert's biological daughter. Years earlier, she had delivered Lena during a traumatic childbirth that claimed the life of her enslaved mother. Donovan, seeking to erase evidence of his actions, ordered the child sold away, only to quietly repurchase her years later when memories had faded. This act of erasure allowed Donovan to maintain his public reputation while perpetuating cycles of abuse. Mammy Eliza had remained silent out of fear and survival, knowing that speaking the truth would bring violence rather than justice. As Lena's pregnancy progressed, Mammy Eliza's silence became unbearable. She understood the biological risks of incest and the moral catastrophe unfolding before her. Yet the systems surrounding her offered no safe avenue for intervention. The enslaved had no legal standing, and the Lambert family's power ensured that truth would be suppressed rather than addressed. Mammy Eliza could only watch and pray that fate would intervene before irreversible harm occurred. Labor began prematurely, lasting nearly an entire day. The pain Lena endured was both physical and symbolic, reflecting the cumulative suffering imposed upon her life. When the child was born, the severity of its deformities was immediately apparent. The infant struggled to breathe, its body bearing unmistakable signs of congenital trauma. The room fell silent as reality asserted itself in the most devastating way possible. Lena's cries were filled with confusion and grief, while Estella stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. The child's brief life ended within hours. Craig insisted on a burial, clinging to ritual as a means of imposing order upon chaos. Yet grief quickly transformed into obsession. He searched for explanations that would absolve him of responsibility, turning to physicians, books, and religious texts. Each unanswered question deepened his despair. Meanwhile, Mammy Eliza's guilt grew unbearable, and she finally revealed the truth to Estella. Estella's world collapsed. The realization that her son had unknowingly committed incest and fathered a child doomed by that act shattered any remaining illusions she held about moral distance from Donovan's sins. The abuse she had tolerated, the silence she had maintained, now revealed itself as complicity. When she told Craig the truth, his reaction was immediate and devastating. Denial gave way to physical illness as understanding took hold. His self-image as a benevolent master disintegrated, replaced by overwhelming guilt and self-loathing. Lena, unaware of the truth, interpreted Craig's withdrawal as abandonment. Her grief manifested in obsessive behaviors as she struggled to process his loss without explanation. When she became pregnant again, fear consumed Craig. In a moment of desperation, he revealed the truth, hoping to prevent further tragedy. Instead, the revelation destroyed Lena's remaining sense of self. Her identity, already fragile under enslavement, collapsed entirely. Lena's psychological deterioration was rapid and severe. Shame, horror, and betrayal converged, leaving her desperate to escape her own body. With Mammy Eliza's reluctant assistance, she attempted to end the pregnancy. The procedure nearly killed her, leaving her weakened and emotionally shattered. Craig's discovery of what had occurred triggered a violent confrontation fueled by guilt, fear, and self-hatred. In the chaos that followed, Lena was killed, her life extinguished by the very system that had exploited her from birth. Craig's suicide followed swiftly. Unable to reconcile his actions with his conscience, he chose death as an escape from accountability. Estella discovered the bodies and was left utterly broken. The sheriff's ruling of temporary insanity preserved the Lambert family's reputation, ensuring that truth remained buried. Lena's death was recorded without ceremony, her story reduced to silence. The plantation changed hands in the years that followed, yet unease lingered. Rumors persisted, whispered among those who sensed that something deeply wrong had occurred. Mammy Elisa carried the truth to her grave, knowing that survival had demanded silence. Eventually, fire consumed the Lambert house, leaving behind ruins reclaimed by nature. The Lambert tragedy reveals how systems of power distort morality, how silence enables abuse, and how inherited guilt perpetuates harm. It serves as a reminder that oppression does not merely victimize individuals, it corrodes entire communities. When truth is buried to protect privilege, it does not disappear. It waits, growing more destructive with time, until it emerges with consequences no one can control.